Fun fact about this cup, I went into my university bookstore to go get a new water bottle. I was actually trying to spend like $15 or $20. This was $40. And then I got up to the register, and I was too embarrassed to tell the clerk that I didn't want to spend $40 on a water bottle, so I just bought it. So, if you ask anyone born in between 1988 and 2009 on their opinions on millennials and Gen X, there's a pretty good chance that they'll say something like this.
Kids these days have never taken a metal bicycle pedal to the shin, and it shows. We're the forgotten generation. Our parents forgot that we existed.
Ask the same of millennials and Gen X about Gen Z, and you'll probably get some equally cynical answers. This phenomenon of general disdain in between generations, the tendency of the younger ones to feel disillusioned and misunderstood, and the older ones to feel cynical and confused, is known as the generational divide. According to sociologist Karl Mannheim's 1928 essay titled The Problem of Generations, generations are usually divided into periods of about 20 to 30 years, during which the inhabitants of that generation will experience several similar experiences, events, and general public opinions. Think of World War II for the silent generation, or the advent of the internet for millennials. This usually creates a collective sentiment amongst the generation that is then expected of the next generation, who, contemporarily, will reject that sentiment because their views have been shaped by other experiences and events. Most recently in history, this divide occurs in terms of social philosophy, with the more progressive idealism of Gen Z and millennials often clashing with the traditionalist and conservative values of Gen X and baby boomers. And though obviously there's no sole reason why this is so evident, I think that there's a key catalyst in recent history that we can point to that explains why older generations are so resistant to change.
I've been with prostitutes and bums and winos and all my life. The street is my world. I don't pretend to go uptown and be anything fancy. I can, but I find more real in the world that I'm in than I do the tinsel. And the real world is the one I have to deal with every day, you know. Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
The Summer of Love. 1967's warmest months saw the city of San Francisco buzzing with sounds of sex, psychedelics, and rock and roll. 100,000 Americans found themselves here, in the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury, eager to experiment with ideology and LSD, all in pursuit of what most called enlightenment. The counterculture, or hippie movement as most Americans remember it today, saw many young Americans abandon their respect for societal norms. They traded in their suits and dresses for bell-bottoms and tie-dye, rejected the idea of the nuclear family and instead embraced communal living, and turned away from the TV and radio to chase the magic of psychedelic rock, folk, and blues. The counterculture movement, in conjunction with the civil and women's rights movements that occurred around the same time, popularized ideas of progressive social reform in the face of decades-long oppression and discrimination. Essentially, those who identified as beatniks, loved children, or visionaries aimed to rebel against the consumerism and social dynamics that had been established by the silent generation post-World War II. As you can probably guess, older American citizens didn't take to these ideas with much enthusiasm. Within the expressions of religious, sexual, and social freedom that marked the counterculture movement, the silent generation likely saw disrespect for the patriotism and stability that they had worked so hard to achieve after the war. This created a climate of generational turbulence that was primed for ominously hypnotic figures like Mary Brunner and Charles Manson. Mary Brunner was born and raised in Wisconsin. She attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison and earned a degree in history before taking a job at the University of California, Berkeley as a libraries assistant. While walking her dog one day right outside of UC Berkeley's Sather Gate, she met a rugged and charismatic drifter with much to say about the current state of the country. According to prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders, quote, Mary was singularly unattractive, and Manson apparently was one of the first persons who thought her worth cultivating. Charles Manson's troubled upbringing made the two very unlikely partners. He had spent half of his life up to this point in federal correctional facilities, and the other half living under the guidance of federal authorities. In prison, Manson spent most of his time honing his guitar skills. By the time that he was released, Charles was an adept songwriter with ambitions of recognition on par with groups like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, who he grew to love. So when he was released from Terminal Island Prison at 33 and dropped in the midst of counterculture California, he figured it would be the perfect environment for his new life. Manson would, like his peers, begin to experiment with LSD and all sorts of philosophy. He developed a fascination with the culture of Haight-Ashbury and the impressionable minds within it, the first of which would be Mary Brunner. Charles would then sweet-talk his way into Mary's life and move into her apartment. There, he'd continue to pursue other women and eventually convince Mary to move them into the home as well. As strange as it sounds, because of the time period, these kinds of living arrangements weren't that impractical. As for those of you who will run to deem Mary Brunner as embarrassingly naive and impressionable for allowing this to happen within her own home, well, you'd be right. But also take into account that Mary was only 24 years old and carrying Manson's first child at the time. Though she wasn't his only lover, she was his first, and in some weird, distorted way, that held a lot of importance to Manson and the other women that began to follow him. The same logic can be applied to most of Manson's earlier followers. Quote, "They were also young, naive, eager to believe, and perhaps even more important, belong. They were followers aplenty for any self-styled guru." It didn't take Manson long to sense this. In the underground milieu into which he'd stumbled, even the fact that he was an ex-convict conferred a certain status. Rapping a line of metaphysical con that borrowed as much from pimping as joint jargon and Scientology, Manson began attracting followers. Almost all girls at first, and then a few young boys. And so was the beginning of the infamous Manson family. Over the next 2 years, Charles began to systematically indoctrinate current and newer members. He moved them out of Brunner's flat and began drifting around California in an adapted school bus like it was like Scooby and the Gang or something.
After all these years. But who are these two?
Don't you recognize them, Sheriff?
Initially, he built allegiance through teachings of love, peace, and defiance of middle-class morality, all values that were very indicative of the counterculture. He introduced the family to LSD and used its effects to convince them that he was some kind of prophetic manifestation of Jesus Christ, who knew of an imminent apocalypse that he called Helter Skelter. Somehow it worked, and soon enough, his followers were loyal enough to follow his instructions at a whim. Manson initially foretold that Helter Skelter would be started by African Americans. However, when 1969 came around and nothing had happened, and when Charlie's money and connections began to dry up, Manson told the family that it would instead be their responsibility to kickstart the apocalypse. August 8th was decided to be the night. As revealed in witness testimony during the trial, Manson ordered one follower, Charles Tex Watson, to take the others and drive up to the residence of film director Roman Polanski and young actress Sharon Tate and take the lives of everyone present in the most gruesome manner possible. The following morning, it was discovered that was exactly what they had done. In one of the most disturbing scenes that LAPD had ever witnessed, 5 people were found dead in and around the Tate residence. Sharon Tate was 8 months pregnant at the time. Los Angeles law enforcement was so overwhelmed with theories of ritualistic activity and satanic cults that they almost failed to connect the Tate case to another crime that had happened the following night. Early in the morning of August 10th, Rosemary and Leno LaBianca were pronounced dead on arrival inside of their own homes. On the fridge, in a suspiciously red tint, were the words Helter Skelter, misspelled. For pretty obvious reasons, I can't really go into the details of the scenes in either of these crimes, but I really encourage everyone to read it out of Vincent Bugliosi's account. It helps to delineate the panic of Americans in reaction to this case. Over the next few weeks, the national media had an absolute field day speculating about the case. Public hysteria was rampant, and the appetite for answers did the LAPD no favors when trying to make connections to the actual perpetrators of this case. Months later, in December of that year, law enforcement was able to connect Manson and his followers to the Tate LaBianca murders and announce warrants for the arrest of Patricia Krenwinkel and Linda Kasabian. Charles Manson and Susan Atkins were already in custody at the time, and Leslie Van Houten was apprehended a bit later. The primary Manson family trial began in June of 1970, with Kasabian promising to testify as the prosecution's main witness in exchange for her immunity. Bugliosi and the state had plenty of witness testimony to make a swift and impactful case, but of course, Manson and his followers would still seem to have other intentions. Krenwinkel and Atkins, often directed by Manson himself, did everything that they could to disrupt the proceedings of the trial. They repeatedly shouted inflammatory statements, made constant appeals to the media and spectators who were present, and, in the footsteps of Manson himself a few days prior, carved X's into their foreheads, in a display that represented them all Xing themselves from the establishment's world. Family members outside of the jail also engaged in spirited protests outside of the courthouse, and even participated in witness intimidation that went as far as drugging other family members who had been called on to testify. I want to make it clear here that when I say family members, I'm talking about other members of the Manson family, not like the actual family members of the defendants. Charles Manson also exhibited erratic behavior in court, going so far as to lunge at the judge after he was denied permission to question a witness. Through all of these efforts, the family would continue to claim to be founded upon the leading ideologies of the counterculture movement: peace, love, and acceptance. All of this would essentially be in vain, however, as, after 8 months of trial, the jury handed out guilty verdicts on all 27 counts that had been levied against the defendants. Manson and all of his followers on trial with him were sentenced to death on April 19, 1971. A year later, the death penalty was abolished in California, and all the initial death sentences were commuted to life in prison.
It's a beautiful day to be 60 to 78 years young. Here's another golden oldie.
Your phone charge is on!
Your phone charge is on.
Have a house.
Lovely.
Your phone torch is on.
Careful, Seymour.
Watch out for the generation gap.
In terms of their overarching mission, not much was really accomplished by the Manson family. Despite this, their effect on the public perception of the counterculture movement was historic. National coverage of the trial and the ideas that Manson and his followers claimed to champion became, in the minds of most, indicative of the ideals of counterculture. Americans began to fear the movement's potential and overshadowed it with cult narratives and rhetoric about moral decay of the youth. In some strange event of situational irony, Haight-Ashbury also began to reflect this change. Following the fantasy of the Summer of Love, the neighborhood became afflicted with foreseeable homelessness, overcrowding, and criminal activity. Law enforcement, rattled by the events of the preceding trial, began to crack down on commune living and organizations that aligned with countercultural ideals. What proved to be most damaging for the movement, however, was the ensuing ideological fragmentation that occurred. One of the reasons why 60s counterculturalism was so effective in the first place was because it overwhelmed routine society with its unity. Though the efforts were centralized in California, the call for more progressive legislation resonated with Americans all over the country. This is where we saw monumental progress in civil rights, women's rights, environmental policy, First Amendment protections, and even the rights of all young American people, with the 26th Amendment. In wake of the cultural shift against counterculture, however, the movement had lost the initial cohesion that made it so successful. This fragmentation made it much easier for mainstream society to dismiss the goals of counterculture and paint the movement as some sort of failed social experiment filled with individuals who couldn't handle real reality. And this wouldn't end in the 60s, or even the 70s. It became a precedent for generations that followed, a stark reminder of how collective idealism can be rejected in the face of mass hysteria and fear. The reason why the idealistic division of the 60s is such an important case study in the analysis of the generational gap was because it was the first time in American history that a multitude of young Americans postured themselves against the beliefs of their parents. As time went on, this pattern of rebellion and pushback became pretty standard, and we still deal with it on both sides of the spectrum today. I don't really have to tell you how prevalent it's become. If you turn on your TV, scroll on TikTok for a little while, or listen to some of your relatives speak during Thanksgiving, then you'll understand the extent of the division. And though it can affect most aspects of American life, I want to speak chiefly on the consequences that the generational divide has on our political process. I know, shut up. It's my channel. French monarchist statesman François Guizot is credited with the wildly popular political saying, "Not to be a Republican at 20 is proof of one of heart. To be one at 30 is proof of one of head." But why do we as Americans, as people, attribute traditional or conservative values with older Americans and progressive or liberal values with younger ones? Well, for a few reasons. First, the values of stability and order that are typically championed by American conservatism are much more appealing to older people. I want to make very clear when I say older people, I'm just talking about anyone above the age of 25. I'm not trying to call everyone that's not Gen Z old. Socio-emotional selectivity theory, proposed by psychologist Laura Carstensen, suggests that people's personal motivations shift with their perception of time. As they age, they become more predisposed towards stable relationships and experiences over novel and unpredictable ones. This often causes people to seek out environments that align with this belief, which bleeds into their political posturing. The second difference lies within the difference in social and economic landscapes that older and younger generations grew up in. The adolescence of the baby boomers and Gen X were defined by eras of rapid economic expansion and historical global instability, which fostered sentiments of self-reliance and loyalty to country and authority. In contrast, millennials and Gen Z came of age with new global connectivity through the internet, economic recession, and generally unpopular foreign policy in the Middle East, making them more likely to challenge institutions and call for social reform. And finally, is the reason that we've been discussing virtually this entire video: fear of change. Let me clarify one thing. Traditional values aren't inherently outdated or in need of reform. There's plenty of traditionalist things that we still need, like familial stability and work ethic and civic responsibility. However, it's often the more harmful values, like stigmatization of alternate lifestyles or the rejection of mental health as a legitimate concern, that we see these champions of traditionalist values go to bat for again and again. We could take into account the conservative narratives on progressive social reform within the last 8 years to prove this. Things that immediately come to mind are the GOP's resistance to comprehensive sex or mental health education in schools, or the strange assertion that any form of gun control will ultimately lead to the stripping of Americans' Second Amendment rights. Here, we see that fear-mongering has been a primary tactic that's used to dissuade the public from voting in favor of these things. I believe the increase in this phenomenon lately is why younger, liberal Americans are more likely to dismiss even the more legitimate concerns of older conservatives as paranoid rambling. Obviously, there's a need for balance between the preservation of beneficial traditions and the essential social progress that we need to make. I guess the overarching question lies in which generation will be the first to extend that olive branch and essentially move towards more American social cohesion. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for your time and for your attention. Let me know about your thoughts on the generational gap, and especially how prevalent it was in the election that we just had. As always, I've never said this before. Make sure to like and subscribe, and comment below any ideas that you have for future videos that I should make.